One of the concerns many Canadians have had about the Syrian refugee crisis is this: could Canada truly welcome, integrate, and provide services for thousands of newcomers? Irvin Studin says not only could we, but he sees a future Canada successfully accommodating a population 3 times bigger than what we have now. And the president of the Institute for 21st Century Questions and editor-in-chief and publisher of Global Brief magazine joins us now with more. Irvin, welcome back to TVO.
Thanks for having me back, Steve.
Let's just start with this. How would you rate the country's response to the Syrian refugee crisis?
Poorly. We've done very poorly, not just in respect of our own history, but across the leading countries in the world. We've been the most passive. We've been the least generous. And I think we're missing a big opportunity. I think Canada, in principle, should be acting, as it always does, with its head and its heart. It's acted with neither imperative. So as a result, we've accepted very few. There's great suffering happening, but for the purpose of national advantage, we've also missed a great opportunity.
I think some people in this country like to think that Canada has a significant role to play on the world stage. Bono's famous line, "The world needs more Canada." In your view, does the rest of the world really look up to Canada at moments like this to demonstrate leadership?
To be perfectly blunt, Steve, and I'm coming from a significant trip in many countries right now back to Toronto. Nobody's talking about Canada in any sense. So in terms of international affairs over the last, I would say, several years, we've been talking to ourselves. We've been talking to ourselves in grand strokes, concocting our own realities, concocting narratives about the world that are pretty much irrelevant, but at the same time allowing different institutions and assets to erode. Whatever happens in the world, to do anything of note, both for the betterment of the world and for national advantage, we need assets. And if we don't construct those basic assets, and population over the long term is one of those assets, we can't do anything.
We'll get to that, but I want to put this quote of Tony Blairs to you. Tony Blair once said, "Canada will become one of the most powerful nations in the world." How do you square that quote with our response to the Syrian refugee situation?
Well, I think Tony Blair is coming from the same tradition, although I think he, as a prime minister, made grave mistakes in international affairs, which we might get to because they were partly causal of the current Syrian refugee crisis. He's working in the same tradition that other great public leaders have worked. And one of them was Churchill, who said that the 20th century would belong to Canada.
And Churchill said that?
Churchill said it just
really?
As much as Laurier said.
Okay.
And he said that Canada would have a population in the approaching 100 million. That was his construct originally. So Blair sees what other people see when they look at the basic assets of Canada. That is, one of the leaders in the world in natural resources. Really the second biggest country in the world. Although we think of ourselves as small, others say we are a bloody huge country. Stable government, 150 years of parliamentary tradition, a deep political culture, great political stability, economic strength. What is the missing asset in that? And it is population. You can't get great things done both nationally and internationally without the right volume and density of population.
Well, you have said that you think 100 million is kind of the magic number that we ought to be aiming at. Where'd you get that number from?
That is more of a construct than anything. If you say, when we first did our interview on your terrific show about 4 years ago, the article about 100 million was written 5 years ago. There's been considerable national momentum in various circles in favor of the idea, some against. People say, well, has your thinking migrated from 100 million? And I would say, yeah, I'm at 101 million right now. It's mainly a construct. Part of it is metaphor, to say that we ought to be thinking long term. Where are we going to be at the end of the century? Is there a kinetic sense to Canada? Are we building for anything? Are we just chubby and happy living our daily existence? And the second one is, in pure policy terms, that 100 million will allow us to accomplish great things as a society, and also, dare I say, to survive in what will be a much more difficult century for us, and we can talk about that as well.
How long do you think it would take for us to, we're whatever, 35, 36 million today, how long would it take to get to 100 million?
It will take to the end of the century, at least. Now, if you look at even generous estimates, I think we'll be hard-pressed to get to 100 million. But when there are crises around the world, I think we should see them in a building sense. That is part of the idea of the metaphor of 100 million. what are we aiming for? In what construct through which prism should we be looking at Syrian refugee crises, Greek fiscal crises, Spanish political crises around the corner, wars in parts of the world where there are educated populations or populations that are in great need? We ought to be looking at them as opportunities for Canada, not in the same breath as they are opportunities to save the world and help humanity. As the rabbi once said, you save one life, you save the world entire. That's Canadian as well. But for national advantage, we're building. How is it that we came to the present paradox that we have the wealthiest generation in Canadian history, the most educated public men and women in Canadian history, strategic leisure, and we're thinking this small, whereas the public men who founded Canada, and many of the women, were far less educated, had far less strategic leisure, were economically impoverished, had a tiny population and knew very little about the world, but thought in broad strokes. This is the present paradox, which makes it very painful to watch our present performance, including in respect of the Syrian crisis.
I'm going to come back to that notion, but I want to make sure I'm clear on what you're saying there. Are you saying that when there is a crisis in another country around the world, as there is in Syria today, Canada has a kind of a self-interest to, not sure this is the right word, so you help me here, to kind of exploit that and therefore take that population into ourselves?
There's no contradiction between, in this case, particularly the Syrian crisis. What I think it's an inelegant way of putting it to say exploit. There are 2 million to 4 million refugees in various parts of the Middle East as a result of that conflict. They've been absorbed mainly by Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey. Many of them are aspiring not just to live, but to live well and do great things. Syria is one of the most educated societies in the Middle East. If you were there 3 or 4 years ago, you would say it was a vibrant place with many erudite people. The bazaars were well functioning, the mines were quick, and it's a young society. It's collapsed, as do societies throughout history. We have a mandate as a fortunate country to save lives, thinking with our heart here, but also to think with our head for national advantage.
Okay, the heart play I get. What's the head play here?
The head play is that there are people who want to make a new life. We need people. Let's match those two. We can be quite deliberate about the people, even in those 2 to 4 million that we accept. But there is a national advantage, of course, imperative there.
Lots of people wondering, though, if these are the quote-unquote right kind of people to bring. There are concerns about security. There are concerns about adaptability and ability to integrate into the Canadian family.
Right. I mean, we're not just talking, the 100 million construct is not just about the Syrian refugees, and I'm not saying that Syrian refugees ought to make up the lion's share of the gap. I'm just saying that this is one episode kinetically over the course of the next 80 years where we'll need to look through a certain prism. What is the point of immigration to Canada? Are we just making up the narrative as we go along and reducing, therefore, the political optics to a stupid debate about the niqab? Or are we building a society, in which case there'll be many more Syrian crises around the corner? And this is just one big one where we ought to be taking many more people because we need them.
But do you agree that there's a right kind of person to welcome to Canada and a wrong kind of person to welcome to Canada?
Yes. And let me just paint it in broad strokes. And we may even talk about the religious aspect, and it has nothing to do with Syria in particular. The right type of person is one who is hungry for success, to live, to thrive. That, I would say, is a good chunk of the Syrian refugee population and refugee populations around the world. 2, people who are desperate. We have an imperative to do that. It's also in the national advantage to welcome desperate people. They do well as a result of the welcome we can get. I am from that same tradition of refugees, if I will. Not newer stock, I would say. I would like to say common stock versus preferred stock.
That's different from old and new, isn't it?
Old and new.
Okay.
It's a different way of pitching it. Security risks. I have that background in a past life in government.
You should just take a few seconds and explain. You're not born in Canada, right?
well, my parents are from the former Soviet Union. I'm a child of Jackson Vanik Jews. We were political refugees that came as a result of the interest of the United States to bring a hungry population, that is hungry in terms of success, to the Western world. I grew up entirely in Canada. I'm fully Canadian. I'm a patriot. But I think about the world and say, this repeats itself.
But your parents, some people would have looked at your parents, ex of the Soviet Union, who came here, whatever it was, probably 1979 or 80 or something like that, and thought, communists, here, we don't need that. They probably wondered about whether your parents were
Not only
threat.
that, but those same refugees today look at the refugees in many cases and paradoxically say, those are the wrong people, right? This is a nativist tradition that is not peculiar to Canada. It's general across the fortunate world.
Do you take I mean, I've heard the argument made that we need to certainly up our game as it relates to the Syrian refugee crisis and immigration and refugees everywhere, because these are people who will do the lousy jobs in this society, and they will represent our pensions of the future. Do you want to take that kind of self-interested a look at it?
No, I don't want to take. I think that's a bit of a base view. If we were hungry like for national building or kinetic like the founders of the country were, we would be in Syria and other crisis spots around the world on the ground with an intelligent cultural radar and saying, I want to know who are the most needy, I want to know who are the most educated, who then also fits the bill in terms of various employment opportunities that need to be filled in Canada. In the event, we're talking a lot about vocational skills that are missing in the Canadian population. Your plumbers, your bricklayers, all of these people, you will find them if you seek them out. But you can't, from our comfortable seat in Ottawa or Toronto or Montreal or Vancouver or Halifax, in the abstract, paint 4 million people with a primitive brush and then say that 10,000 over the course of 3 years or 12,000 over the course of 3 years is an adequate response. We're talking to ourselves.
Here's what you wrote in your magazine Global Brief 5 years ago, and let's see if your thinking has changed at all on this. Canadians largely fancy themselves citizens either of a small or at most a middle or principled power. There is little state or collective ambition to use strategic levers to be a player of any consequence in international affairs, and even less national cognizance that, with the requisite political acumen and chutzpah, the levers of strategic power available to Canada to be a driving force in the grand anarchy of international affairs are very considerable. A justified national self-confidence does reign, however, in the capacity of Canada to lead the world or to be among the world's leaders in largely internal matters of federalism, human rights, and the integration of the outsider, immigrants, of which Canada, on a per capita basis, takes in the most in the world, into the national fold. You've laid out a very ambitious international role for Canada to play. Who else in this country embraces that role? In a political position.
We're getting there. I would say, let me say two things. One related to who embrace, and two just to elaborate on that. And thank you for pronouncing chutzpah with the requisite Yiddish.
That's a technical term in international affairs, isn't it?
It's definitely a technical term, and one that is greatly required today. Let me say this quietly, and I know a lot of the players in all parties and bureaucratic as well, and the province as well. They all understand this. And many, even paradoxically, because their behavior would seem to be at odds with what I'm proposing or what I proposed, they all understand. They all are in agreement. The question is, can they deliver? Do they even know how to deliver? And this is actually where my thinking has come. And let me put this metaphor to you to get to the second point about how we can get it done. We're a hockey nation. I have kids in hockey. I grew up playing hockey. If I say to Canadians and to my fellow Canadians that we need to be in the world affairs, including in respect to the Syrian crisis, but in terms of assessing war and peace and great economic achievement and saving the planet through a variety of activities, we need to be hockey players. What is a hockey player? Well, if I say that a hockey player in Canada is of a different breed psychologically, everybody understands that. You go to an arena, it's a different tempo. The question is, does that mentality replicate itself in any other aspect of Canadian life? And I dare say that precious few. It used to be federalism. We have superior juridical classes. But in international affairs, we're blatantly colonial. We're not hockey players at all. This is why I said we've constructed this narrative of us being hockey players, but mainly talking to ourselves, to a public which is still quite naive in being able to assess that. Now, if you have a hockey arena and you have a hockey person who is a charlatan, who is waxing eloquently about things that have little to do with hockey realities, he or she will be called out quickly. But if we have the Prime Minister or cabinet ministers or so-called experts talking about the world and what Canada ought to be doing to a public that is not yet sufficiently cultured to be able to call them out, we have a big problem. Over the last 150 years, we've had great good fortune strategically, so pretenders in that sense haven't had to be called out. We haven't had grave existential threats to Canada. But what I'm suggesting is that this century will be far more difficult. It doesn't happen that more than 150 years, a country enjoys the same strategic fortune that Canada has enjoyed. It's been quite exceptional. So when that does come to bear on Canada, will we be able to play at that level? So the 100 million construct is partly about that. Can we be hockey players in international affairs?
It's funny you use that metaphor. Look at what question 11 was.
Right.
That was where I was going next.
Right.
And the question was going to be, except for hockey, we don't seem to give a damn about being number one in the world at anything. We definitely want to be number one at hockey. But beyond that, we don't. Where do you see the evidence that Canadians care enough about international affairs that they want to play, you know this expression, they want to punch above their weight or play an outsized role in international affairs?
I really don't like that expression, punch above our weight. It is peculiarly Canadian. Now, someone should say, well, what's a Canadian? I should, well, I wrote a book called What is a Canadian? So I've explored that. We ought to punch or not punch. The punch is only in the absolute. It's only a country that's disproportionately insecure that says, well, we're punching above a certain weight. Mm-hmm. For God's sake, we're 36 million people with the second largest territory in the world. We can pack a big punch. Most people see that. We psychologically pack very small. Now, to your question about whether we're interested in the world, I don't see much evidence of that. I see evidence of it in certain plays, in certain quarters, intellectually in some parts, certainly in the diasporic communities. But this is a problem. How do we fix it? Well, historically, there are only two ways of getting us to play more seriously. One is far more preferable and efficient. The inefficient and least preferred way is events. If a cataclysmic event or great pressures come to bear on Canada and we're not prepared to play at the level that's requisite, given our geography, our assets, our place in the world, we're in trouble. You know, the worst case is we could lose the country over the course of the century. Countries, don't forget, don't tend to last longer than 60 years. We could become a strategic cripple. That is, another country, let's say the United States or another power, decides the terms of our existence. Right? That used to be called imperialism, but the world is made up of builders and those who live on the terms of the builders. The far more efficient vector is for us to have great leadership. Leadership over the course of 10 or 15 years, which says we are going to build institutions and assets that allow us to play at that level of seriousness. Without that level of seriousness, it is, to use a soccer metaphor, that's my other sport, like punching with your toe, like kicking with your toe, whereas you need to kick with the entire torso. If you're kicking with your toe, then the opponent ought not to be impressed. If you're kicking with your torso, then you have all the assets aligned for great potency. And what I'm saying is that apart from population and psychology, Canada has all the assets to have a torso of great magnitude.
Then help us understand this. You are in a city right now, the capital city of the province of Ontario, where more than half the people in this city are not born in this country, right? They're from somewhere else. We, per capita, welcome more immigrants than anybody else in the world here, and in the main, remarkably well integrate them into the Canadian family.
Yes.
And yet, in spite of that, we don't appear to have a heck of a lot of interest in international affairs or playing a significant role. How does that make any sense?
It makes great sense. One of the things that's wonderful about Canada, and Toronto in particular, I'm a Torontonian, it's the most absorptive city in the world. Everybody comes, and within 5 years, they're a Torontonian. Within a generation, they're fully Canadian. We assimilate, notwithstanding metaphors about mosaics, we assimilate extremely well through the schools. Everybody can swear in about 20 tongues in Toronto. Half the city speaks with an accent and nobody blinks. The rate of violence in Toronto is inferior to any other big city in the Western Hemisphere.
It's almost as if once we're here, we sort of say, okay, we're here, let's forget about everything else.
That's right. And that's explained very easily. What is the threat? There is no existential threat. Look at our borders. I've just come from lecturing in the former Soviet Union. If you look at countries like Russia and China, they each have 14 borders. Canada has one border. And we pacified that border in 1871, the Treaty of Washington with the United States. That was our natural enemy. Today, we don't blink about that country. But this century, I would say that we're going to have 4 borders de facto. And those are called acre. America, evidently, to the south. Sea is China, which is back to its old place where it was at Confederation before the Opium Wars, at the center of global events. It's a serious country to be reckoned with for the rest of the century. So we are closer to China from Vancouver than is Australia from Sydney. We are more Chinese or more Asian than is Australia, just that we don't realize it from our comfortable homes in Halifax, Toronto, and Ottawa. That's the C. The R is Russia. Yeah. Russia is not a proposition in the abstract to the east of Ukraine. Russia is our big neighbor to the north. There are 2 big countries this century in the Arctic, Russia and Canada. We better have a great relationship with Russia, because countries that have poor relationships around their borders with big countries don't survive very long. We have China, we have Russia, we have America. And then E, A-C-R-E, is Europe. Europe is to our east. The European proposition is relevant for all the ACR, but it's also relevant because Europe is a magnificent construction of 28 countries today, but it might not be 28 stable countries by the end of the century. It's just miraculous that they've been able to rein in Germany and construct this peace project over the last 50 years. That this will survive is a little bit ahistorical. It's in our great interest that Europe should be peaceful, but we're going to have to navigate that landscape much more skillfully. Can we do it?
Does the improved, let me start with the R. Does an improved relationship with Russia require Putin and Harper to vacate the scene?
No, not at all.
Given the antipathy between the 2 of them.
There'll be always antipathy, and relationships are not just personal. Of course, in that part of the world, a lot of business is done informally, and personal relationships are important. We need to be, just as with Russia, just as with China, much more intelligent. And that is, consider Israel, consider Singapore, improbable countries, tiny, that are much more promiscuous than Canada in international affairs. That is, they can work one way with one country, another way with another country. And the idea is to minimize the aggregate frictions around their borders so that they don't have enemies closing in on them at the same time, or in the German case, two-border warfare. We need to be much more intelligent. So if we're interested in the Ukraine crisis, that's just one issue amongst many with Russia. If we're interested in Chinese human rights, that's just one issue in 1,000 in respect of the Chinese transactions, because they're at our borders. They have now existential consequence for Canada. But we're not yet there psychologically. So Harper, Putin, that's not the point. The point is that at the level of the leadership of Canada, and I hope it comes in after my generation, that we're sufficiently sophisticated to realize that our mental map is much more flexible and much more real, and that we can play credibly. Because frankly, when we look at foreign minister to foreign minister affairs today in Canada, they don't take us seriously. We can put a presumptively intelligent man or woman there, but the other person is of playing for keeps. And they don't look at us as they would some of our hockey players.
Let's finish up on this. 100 years ago, we were a country of 8 million people. We are about 4 times bigger than that right now. So do you think it will take another 100 years for this country to have a population that's 3 or 4 times the size it is right now?
I think so. I think we're well on our way.
It can be done?
Of course it can be. There are two things I would say. One, we're well on our way. So whether you want more Syrian refugees or refugees from the next crisis or to up the immigrant level, we're well on our way. On different scenarios, we'll be between 60, 70 to 80, 90 by the end of this century. Now, Will Canada be around at the end of this century? I think that needs to be assured. That needs to be assured through good fortune, but also great skill, because countries don't survive by accident for 250 years. And it's there that my concern lies. And the 100 million construct is an attempt to say, we need to think about the future, and we need to be much more deliberate and strategic in planning for that future.
I would simply hold this up and say, this is your work, Global Brief, World Affairs in the 21st Century. Irvin Studin has been our guest, president of the Institute for 21st Century Questions, editor-in-chief and publisher of this very excellent magazine. And as always, Irvin, we thank you for coming into TVO and sharing your views with us.
Thanks for continuing your great work.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.